So, welcome to all our listeners. I sincerely apologize for the delay. I should have been here at 28. I'm so sorry. Am I audible?
Yes, perfectly audible and no worries. Let's kick it off.
Wonderful, wonderful. So today, as a guest speaker, we've got Dr. J P Narayan, Jaya Prakash Narayan, who obviously needs no introduction, and he's been trained as a physician, has been in the Indian administrative services for a very long period of time, resigned in 1996, and then started a new ideology, a political reform, gradually into a political party named Lok Satta Party. And it is an honor to have you here, Dr. Narayan.
Well, the pleasure is mine. Is it who is speaking now?
My name is Pushkar. Thank you.
Pushkar. Pleasure is mine, Pushkar. Please go on.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jai Prakash sir. So, sir, we would, since it's just 20 minutes, we would directly want to dive into your journey and learn from it. So, sir, how about starting with, how you started the entire thing as how you got into the Indian administrative services?
I think quite a few people know a bit about that. I grew up in a village, went to Telugu medium school, government school, and the usual things in a southern Indian rural setting. I went to a Jesuit college. We call it college because basically it's plus 2, 11th and 12th grades. That's how the structure was, and is in fact in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana even today. Then I went into medicine. Until that time, I don't think I really had much of an understanding of what's happening in India, except what you read in textbooks, etc. But 73, around 73, 74, that was a seminal period in India. Just as we're now talking about 75th year of independence, those were the days of 25th year of independence. So a lot of churning, a lot of discussion, and a concern that the fruits of liberty or freedom were not really realized. Many of the hopes were not fully realized. That was the general feeling. Already there was a sense of corruption, misgovernance, abuse of power, and unemployment, and of course poverty, mass poverty. Then movements came about in the country, in various parts of the country. And the governing system, instead of responding to it creatively, understanding the people's urges, setting an agenda, and mobilizing public opinion, tried to crush it. The emergency was a result of that. And I was one of those very deeply, deeply influenced by emergency. I was not personally affected in the sense I was not in jail or something. I was only kept under surveillance. But as an idea that the whole country could be converted into some kind of a jail and liberties could be extinguished so easily, that was extremely offensive to our sensibilities. A whole lot of us across the country, tens of thousands of us. I was one of those. And then emergency was lifted. Somebody suggested maybe join the civil services. That's how I got into civil services. And the rest of the journey, whether I wear a civil servant hat or a civil society leader's hat, or a brief span political hat, doesn't matter what it is, it's the same journey. The hats vary, but the purpose, the goals, and the effort are roughly the same.
Right. Absolutely. Actually, we lost you in between. There was some audio loss, and we couldn't really hear you that well to the part where you were just explaining about how you joined the civil service. Somebody suggested that you should join civil services.
Yeah, that was the time when they opened up the civil services to doctors. Until the time, doctors were prohibited. Then I got into it, and I was lucky that I could do something. I could learn a great deal, and maybe understand what are the systemic defects. And once I understood, I felt that you can't simply not rest on your laurels and then enjoy the fruits of a government job at the middle and high level. You actually have to work for change in the country. That's when I quit the government. And then since then, in various forms, the journey, as I said, is the same. The goals are the same. As long as the methods are constitutional and legal and ethical, it doesn't matter what hat you wear. Essentially, it's quest for reform in the governance process in the country.
Right. Of course. So how was this transition? Because you see the objective was the same. However, what comes to mind is there's a difference altogether. Once you being in the civil services, and then and then being, a reformer, an activist to commence with. So how was that transition to you?
It was actually pretty smooth for me, contrary to popular belief. I don't even recall the date on which I left the government. It was not imprinted on my mind. I vaguely recall the rough period. It was 25 years ago. Around this time, or a couple of months later, maybe I put in my papers around this time or a little before this, and maybe I got the relief about 3 months later. That apart, I don't recall like the date or anything. It was not at all an important thing. What's important is why I was leaving. I was pretty clear-headed. It was not momentary. It was not emotional. It was not casual. It was well thought out. It is for a clearly defined agenda. It was not with bitterness or a sense of despair or failure. In fact, I was regarded as one of the most successful civil servants in the history of post-independence India. So most people ask the question, why are you quitting? Not why not quit. So that was not the issue.
Right.
So basically, once you realize what needed to be done, and I believe I had the good fortune to understand a little bit, then do you have the obligation to work for it, or you simply, because you have a certain techno-managerial position and you are a civil servant with a great deal of public regard, etc., in a country where civil servants are venerated, or do you actually try and bring about the change and mobilize public opinion? To me, the choice was very simple and straightforward. And I made up my mind well before I left government. I left in 96, but in 83, when I was married, I told my future wife that if she was marrying me because I was in the civil services, then she should not. I was almost certain to quit the service and work for reform in some form. I did not know in what form. That circumstances will dictate. So it was not really such a heart-wrenching, painful, difficult decision. I wish I could tell you this was something dramatic, painful, etc. Nothing like that.
Right. Wow. Yeah, that is primarily because of the clarity of thought, one could say, because this is something which would
I
really
hope
inspire a
so.
lot of youth.
See, in our country, unfortunately, we put too much of premium on positions of power. Not even power, the positions. It's all about seeking salience, who is in and who is out. Luckily for me, I was never influenced by that. It was irrelevant to me whether you're in or you're out. What you're doing is what matters. In a sane society, actually, we don't have to do all this. Frankly, if there's some good humor, some lovely literature, nice conversations, and nature, I would be very happy and content. You have to do it because it's necessary. That's what drives you. So there is this notion of power and position is somewhat silly. I know it's universal in this country particularly, but I think we must shed that culture. That's a very silly approach. Nobody asks you what you have accomplished. They ask you what position you occupied. It's very typical of a country. That's not a very wise way of looking at it. I luckily never defined myself by the position I held, then or later.
Sorry, go ahead, Pushkar.
Sorry. Go on. Anurag.
So, Dr. Jayaprakash, I mean, so it seems like, that, as you said, right, some people get the idea and then invest behind it rather than kind of keep sitting in whatever position that they were in, right? But the decision to then get into politics, and not just into politics, but also to start your own new reformist party, right? Is that a much more tougher decision than to kind of go and join hands with somebody who exists, whose ideology might have
Actually,
some
the
match?
sequence of events was a little different, Anurag. I never considered a party political option, not because I believed politics is wrong. In fact, I coined the expression politics as a noble endeavor. And I stand by that. I probably repeated this ad nauseum in the country, in a country where politics is reviled universally, because in a democracy, you can't be without politics. But you have to define politics sensibly. Not because politics is bad, but because the work I set out for myself then and now is not really party political. It's not a partisan issue. It's not something where we have a debate whether it's right or wrong. It's fundamentally necessary, most of it at least. There's no room for two positions. Therefore, it's not amenable to party political kind of work. And two, personally, my qualities then or now are not in dividing people. I'm always a person who tries to synthesize, bring people together, find a workable idea rather than divide people and yes and no and kind of thing. Many people who have some idea of what I do or what I say, they know that. So I never considered that. Therefore, I left the government with an intention to help found a reform movement. and reform work. And that's what I did. In 1996, I founded Foundation for Democratic Reforms along with a few like-minded colleagues who stood fiercely loyal to me and the cause since then for the past 25 years. Then within a few weeks or months, I founded Lok Satta movement, not party. The party came 10 years later after significant number of accomplishments, at least by contemporary standards, without any formal power. Lok Satta was fairly successful in generating ideas and maybe making some things happen across the country. But we realized that unless you are able to mobilize a reasonable section, let's say about 10% of the public, on a sustained basis. It's not a winning vote. In our electoral system, 10% is not a winning vote. But if 10% vote you can mobilize on a sustained basis, then the mainstream parties competing for power will have to take notice and they'll embrace the agenda. That's how real change happens world over. So a time came in 2006, 10 years after we launched the movement, when we felt that this was probably necessary. That was actually a very difficult and painful moment because I was not cut out for partisanship in any way. I mean, that's not part of my DNA at all. But as a strategic tool to mobilize a reasonable vote on a sustained basis as a pressure point on the political system, we made that decision. But our calculations did not prove to be right. Except urban India, we were getting nearly 10%, big cities, etc. But rural India, we were not getting more than about 1% vote. It's not because Lok Satta is not known. It's not because Lok Satta is not respected. But politics is different. Vote is different in our country. Maybe if we have time in the remaining time, we can discuss. Otherwise, on some other occasion, we can discuss. It's not a simple question of a good guy with a good agenda comes forward, we vote for it. There are very complex reasons in an immature democracy with a vast amount of illiteracy, high degree of centralization, and most of all, very little understanding of the link between the vote and the consequences of vote to me as a human being and my family. Without that, democracy will not work. The grand idea of Bharat Mata and democracy, it's a romantic dream. That's not the way democracy improves. So whatever the reason, what I want to emphasize is the quest was not to found a political party. And the moment we felt, after some years of very intense, very hard effort, that a party political effort is not really going to gain any traction. And if it's not going to be a tool, an instrument for accelerating reform, there's no point wasting energy. You must channelize that energy more constructively. So it's not the political party, it's the political reform. And even as a political party, we did not act as a typical political party. Never any invective, never abuse or rhetoric, and never populism in a cheap sense. It's always to try and find solutions and persuade the people.
So what is the solution then, right? So if you go from civil services to forming a political point of view or an agenda for reform and then a political party, I mean, that doesn't succeed because a good guy with a good agenda is not enough. Then what is the next path, or what's the next step to this whole thing?
There is no next path. There is no one shoe fit all solution. There is no instant solution. There is no panacea. We have to do two things simultaneously. One, to create conditions for this kind of reform impulse to survive and to strengthen. A lot of people, for instance, all of us sitting discussing now or across the country, millions of people, various languages, regions, religions, and cultures, they want the same things. And yet, we don't have conditions in which their energies can be channelized productively for a political outcome to force the pace of change. So, how do you create those instruments? That is one path. Delhi, for instance, what happened? Because Delhi is a very high income city state relative to Indian standards, 350,000 rupees per capita income, much higher than anywhere else. Therefore, a higher proportion of people, they are willing to vote beyond money that they receive or some caste and region. Not that they're completely irrelevant in Delhi politics, but to a large extent, they can be contained. But more important, by a historical accident, unlike any other place in the country, Delhi alone has a genuine local government. Delhi government is nothing but an effective local government with limited local government powers compared to global standards, but it's the most empowered local government in India. Therefore, people could see the link between the vote and the consequences. Supposing we have a condition like that in all cities to start with, rural India is a different ball game. Again, there's no time to go into that. But in cities to start with, I'm sure a similar thing like in Delhi will happen elsewhere in the country. But we shut that door. We have created an over-centralized governance system, irrespective of which party is in power. So that is one kind of path. The other path is going to specific systemic reforms. For instance, how to institutionalize rule of law. Normatively, we have rule of law, but we have no rule of law in reality. As long as there's no real rule of law, you can't improve the content of democracy or make it accountable. How do you change the nature of a politics, electoral system, political parties? So the specific reform agenda. From time to time, when an opportunity presents itself, utilizing the power of the context, you must further that agenda because you already know exactly what needs to be done. There's a prepared mind or a set of minds. So it's a very complex process and a prolonged process. There's no instant nirvana.
That makes so much sense. Pratyasha?
Yeah. Dr. Jayaprakash, my question was more around your work with the NAC and the Administrative Reforms Commission. I think one of the things that is very synonymous with your name is your work against, anti-graft. You've been a very vocal crusader against corruption. Even during the Lokpal movement, we heard a lot of different ideas coming from you with regards to how the movement needs to be structured. So, if we look at some of the work around that period, and particularly with your focus on administrative and political reforms, would there be like 2 to 3 points that you feel are absolutely necessary at this stage and which have been pushed to the background, and there needs to be an immediate discussion around those in order to move forward? So, that's my question.
Pratyasha, there are three broad areas if you really want to change. One is rule of law, of which this Lokpal movement is a part of it. The whole idea of accountability to prevent abuse of power is merely an extension of the broader concept of rule of law. Now, as you are reminding me, I remember on the 24th of April 2011, I hosted a roundtable in the country, in Delhi, with some of the finest minds, two very eminent former Supreme Court Chief Justices, several other Supreme Court judges, uh, many constitutional authorities who held those offices with great distinction, many anti-corruption officials, great advocates, Anna Hazare's team, except Hazare, who was unwell that day, everybody else, including Arvind, Prashant, Shanti Bhushan, and Kiran Bedi, they all came. We identified, for instance, 26 areas where there are some disputes. Anna Hazare movement, however worthy it is, sort of glossed over everything and pretended that there's one simple solution and that solves the problem, which is actually a very unworkable model. 20 million public servants of India, from cabinet secretary to a chaprasi, that they all can be managed by one high ombudsman and the system actually will deliver is a very, not a very mature idea. And on all 26 items, a consensus was arrived at, a mature consensus based on evidence. The Lokpal law as enacted is substantially a result of those 26 consensus elements. But the sad part is you may have a nice legislation. It really did not work because there's no political commitment behind it. Today, pardon my saying so, we have a colorless, orderless, tasteless Lokpal. I don't think you and I can even name who the Lokpal is because it doesn't matter. It is not meant to matter. We went through the motions perfunctorily. But basically, the rule of law is a broad area: police, prosecution, anti-corruption mechanism, and speedy justice. The second broad area is the political parties and electoral system. Can we democratize the political parties, and can we create an electoral system where vote buying and freebies, the incentive is altered? It's not so much that somebody is bad or guilty or anything. Politicians are as much victims as their villains, as I keep saying. Therefore, can we create conditions where the talent of politicians is channelized constructively, not destructively? And there are ways of doing it. And the third broad area, I already hinted that, empower local governments in a responsible way and an accountable way. I live in a fifth floor apartment right now. I'm speaking to you from there. Supposing the elevator does not work, the lift does not function, I'm not going to keep quiet. I'm going to holler. I'm not going to use constitutional arguments. I am paying a monthly maintenance. I need it. And if the lift doesn't work, my elderly mother cannot climb up and down the stairs. And there's terrible inconvenience. And we have all chosen you to maintain that. What the hell is happening? That is true democracy. Now, until that happens, until democracy goes beyond our notions of vote and shout, but actually a responsible citizenship and an understanding of where my vote is going, where my money is going, and what happens to me as a consequence directly and immediately. And that is local government with accountability. I'm not a romantic. I know that there could be a lot of flaws at every level, but there are ways of designing that. So these are the three broad areas. And these are common sense areas. We all know it's necessary. But our lust for power, our sense of insecurity, our desperation that, my God, if I part with power, I become insecure. Nobody bothers about me or salute me. This is very endemic to India, not merely a few politicians. It is part of our hierarchical culture. Unless we have the leadership which has the wisdom and the foresight to look at these things and institutionalize, not one fell swoop. However anxious you are, it can't happen overnight. But in a systematic manner. That's what great leadership is about. That's what people like Gladstone have done to transform.
Sorry, we lost you, Doctor. We're not.
A lot of shouting and a lot of activity for accomplishment.
Sorry, we lost you in between. We just lost you again. But what we get from the crux of it, what I got from the crux of it is more accountability is what is required in the system, and that is where we are. One of the ways where we are heading, where we should be heading rather. There's a question from one of our audience. I'm just picking that up and reading it as it is. Sir,
Okay. Okay.
isn't the parties being populist and effect the cause of which are more system related?
Absolutely. I agree with you. See, when there's poverty and centralization, populism is inevitable. Because when you say populism, what is the meaning? That you are indulging in short-term populism at the cost of long-term public good. Often there is a clash there's a trade-off between long-term public good and short-term popularity. Now, if you don't create conditions in which people are unable to realize what is the long-term good, and in the place of the short-term populist policies, what is the real benefit that will accrue to you, you can never win through rational policy in a democracy.